I punched you infinity plus 1 times.
You don't just get to be a Family Guy without making a few enemies. Just ask Peter Griffin. His enemies come in all shapes, sizes, and of course, moral alignments. I'm Keefe Nosy with Wicked Binge, and this is Peter Griffin's Enemies. Good to Evil. To kick things off, we have a couple of characters who aren't really bad guys, but more so victims of Peter's schemes. These are the good. Hold on to your cowboy hats and mustaches, because we're kicking things off with Mayor Wild West. Say what you will about the newer seasons of Family Guy, but hiring Sam Elliott as the new mayor of Quahog is a pretty sweet choice. Wild West is the cousin of Adam West, rest in peace, as well as the current mayor of Quahog after Peter helped convince him to run with the power to fly and be an all-around swell guy. He's generous, fair, and extremely forgiving, as even when Peter tries to sabotage his campaign out of jealousy when Lois accidentally says Wild West's name during sex, he himself reaches out to patch things up by giving Peter a basket of baby mustaches. He's no replacement for Adam West, but Wild West is an all-around nice guy who adds an element of wholesomeness to Quahog, a nice change of pace that earns him the gold medal of good. Though he does raise one question. You ever killed a man, Peter?
Peter, have you ever killed a man?
The silver medal of good, as well as Peter's only other good adversary, goes to Family Guy's most unfortunate character, Meg Griffin. Peter has mistreated all of his family at some point or another, but none as often or as cruelly as Meg. In the earlier seasons, Peter loved Meg dearly and was trying his best to be a good father to her, even saying he'd take a bullet for her on at least one occasion. But around season 4, the series slowly started to become a lot meaner to Meg, and from there, it didn't take long for Peter to devolve into an abusive psychopath who bullies Meg for fun. Although he still has some episodes that show his care for her deep down, things really have devolved. Which is a shame, because despite her flaws, Meg is a good kid who genuinely just wants to connect with her family.
Maybe if I feel bad, they don't have to.
At her worst, she's a little bit selfish or unstable, one of which can be chalked up to simply being a teenager, and the other to her being constantly abused. Heck, Peter even guilt trips Meg when she finally calls him out for his abuse in Seahorse Seashell Party. Even though they still have their moments, Peter's hobby of tormenting his daughter has become one of Family Guy's meanest and most iconic running gags, cementing her position in a list like this. These next enemies are a little less family friendly, so be ready for some rough characters in the gray area. If there's any character everyone knew would be on this list, it's Ernie, the giant chicken. Rarely does a season go by without at least one increasingly epic and kind of excessive fight between Peter and this chicken. There's blame to be had on both ends, really. Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon, which might have been well-intentioned, but ended up starting a 20-ish year rivalry that shows no sign of stopping. As for Peter, well, technically he did make the first strike, so this rivalry is honestly on him. While there's no justification for their use of violence, attempted murder against each other, and mass destruction of property, let's take a look outside of that realm. Ernie is actually a pretty regular guy, and has even attempted to be friendly with Peter on occasion. Who knows? Maybe he's the nicest guy around in the gigantic talking chicken community, but he's still got to be in the gray area just on the off chance that there's a bit more deviousness in this guy's drumsticks. And again, there's a concerning amount of property damage and possibly manslaughter under his belt. From Peter's canonical arch rival, we now move on to his more meta arch rival, Homer Simpson. While the Simpsons guy is largely regarded as a highly underwhelming crossover of the USA's two most beloved adult cartoons of all time, it was still interesting to see Peter and Homer interact. They become good buddies quickly, with Homer helping Peter find his stolen car and even letting the Griffins stay with him for a while. But when Homer insults Pawtucket Patriot Ale, calling it a cheap imitation of Duff, the two take things to court, causing Peter to potentially lose his job.
You can't just slap a new label on something and call it your own!
While Homer does show remorse, the two still end up having their own chicken fight-esque battle in the streets of Springfield before the special ends, making Homer guilty of the crimes we attributed to Ernie earlier. The reason he's a bit lower is because of his own sins back in his own series. Granted, Homer is much more of a nice and overall moral man than Peter, nowhere near the psychotic personality the latter had developed into by this point, but he's still got a lot of issues he needs to clean up in his act. In that regard, maybe he'd do well to pay a visit to our friend, Mr. Washiwashi, owner and proprietor of Super Cowboy USA Hot Dog Rocket Ship American Cleaners #1. He's a minor antagonist and only appears in a handful of episodes. When Peter suspects that his usual dry cleaner has stolen his white shirt, he goes as far as to break into his home to try and prove it, even though Washiwashi has told him that he didn't steal it. When he threatens that he can kill Peter legally, a compromise is found by the two having a Street Fighter-esque duel, showing that the man can fight. Additionally, Washiwashi has a bit of a mean streak. Actually, scratch that. He's a borderline sadist. When he gives Peter violin lessons in one episode, he verbally abuses him, forces him to make his fingers bleed, and even presses a hot iron on his back.
Try harder! Play better!
His clothes may be clean, but this guy's got some pretty dirty tendencies. Speaking of episodes that make you feel bad for Peter, up next we talk about one of his most controversial conflicts, Angela. First things first, rest in peace, Carrie Fisher, but there's admittedly less sympathy on our end for Peter's former boss. On one hand, Angela usually isn't too bad. Generally speaking, she's a bit of a tough boss, but given how much of a slacker Peter is, not to mention how much of a genuine danger he can be at other times, it's easy to understand where she's coming from.
Griffin, you're fired!
There's even an element of pity we have for her, given how genuinely lonely she's shown to be. But there's one episode in particular that cements her placement here. Season 8's Peter Harassment. In this episode, Angela repeatedly molests Peter at work, forcing him to rub soda cans on his body and even trying to coerce him into having sex with her. She even goes as far as to psychologically manipulate Peter into believing she's suicidal, so he'll do the deed, only to smugly tell him she'll see him later afterwards. It's a shame, really. She might have even had a shot at being in the good category if it weren't for this admittedly massive blemish on her record.
Randy!
No, seriously, Randy Fulcher is up next. Look, nobody likes a bully, especially if all that bully does is pants you every chance he gets. Though on one occasion, he pulls up your pants at a urinal, which shows that he has at least some standards. Actually, is that worse? Admittedly, it's hard not to feel at least a bit bad for Randy developing multiple sclerosis in his adult years, requiring crutches to move his now handicapped body, but he doesn't really seem remorseful for his bullying. His crimes aren't really that egregious, and he seems to have become a mild-mannered guy, but really, the least he could have done was apologize to Peter for bullying him in school, especially considering he immediately recognized him. Still, it's usually not good to hit a guy with MS, Peter. At the end of the gray area, we have someone to care for, to be there for. We have James Woods. James Woods might seem at face value as a character who belongs squarely in the bad to evil territory. After all, he is one of Peter's most frequent enemies and appears in many of the series' most iconic episodes, even the Murder Mystery Special and Then There Were Fewer. Though his friendship with Peter is initially quite wholesome and sweet, it turns sour when Lois becomes uncomfortable with him being around so much. This leads to James Woods essentially becoming a yandere who stalks Peter, threatens his family, takes his identity, and just generally causes whatever inconvenience he can. If he can't have Peter, nobody can, and nobody can stop his reckless revenge attempts. That is, unless they have some delicious Reese's Pieces, but saving him from the full-on bad to evil territory, James Woods does find his redemption in the aforementioned murder mystery, where he falls in love with a woman named Priscilla, who shows him the Christian faith. He becomes a believer and genuinely repents for his wrongdoings, setting up a dinner party to make amends for them. Later on, when he's inexplicably brought back from the dead, he's even on good terms with Peter again, showing that he may well have learned his lesson. His crimes are some of the most egregious on our list, but everyone deserves a shot at redemption, right? Unfortunately, these characters are unlikely to take such a shot. These are the bad to evil. There are a lot of baddies to talk about here, so we'll talk about the least violent of them first. Francis Griffin. Francis is Peter's adoptive father, who he struggles very greatly to relate to or bond with. He's a religious zealot in every sense of the word, constantly verbally abusing Peter and his whole family, particularly Lois, Peter's president whore of a wife, as she's called by him. His overbearing approach to religion causes pressure for everyone around him way too much. He even causes Chris to grow intensely constipated when he refuses to let him use the bathroom. He's really just trying to take a dump, man.
I know what you're doing in there, and it's a sin.
As mean as Francis is, he's, well, there's nothing good to say about him. But if nothing else, he's just not as bad as the characters beneath him. The first of whom is Peter's older sister, Karen Griffin. The last of Peter's biological family we'll be talking about today is Heavy Flo, Peter's sister who's been bullying him since childhood. From her habit of farting in his face to the genuine joy she takes in harming him, it's clear that her abuse of Peter is no small part of what made him the heavily troubled, abusive man he is today. Noteworthy is that Karen never apologizes to Peter, nor shows any remorse for her actions. It takes Peter and Meg beating her into a coma for her bullying to finally stop, and not by the usual means. She's not higher because, despite her horrid treatment of Peter, she's actually quite capable of being friendly with other members of his family, though there was the time she used 9/11 to advertise her next wrestling match. Yeah, no, this placement's fine. Things are only gonna get more bizarre from here on out, and it all starts with Bill Clinton. In the first of many occurrences that made fans question Peter and Lois's relationship, the episode Bill and Peter's Bogus Journey has the two titular characters becoming good friends. That said, Bill Clinton, in this particular portrayal, is an absolute sexual deviant. Most notoriously, he coerces Lois into having sex with him, knowing full well she's the wife of his new best friend. At the end of the episode, he even sleeps with Peter too. It really makes you wonder if this is all just some sick, twisted game to him, but either way, I think it's safe to say Bill isn't getting Peter's vote, though he's far from the president he has the most beef with, actually. Before any of that though, let's talk about the man who was once confronts Peter's greatest hero, the Black Knight. It's the old Renaissance fair, and Peter's excited to follow his dream of becoming a jouster like the Black Knight, who saved him as a teen from falling to his death and following a dark path. That said, something definitely changed since that day. The Black Knight is an overly competitive, arrogant jerk who only seems to want to keep people around who don't threaten his fragile ego.
Hey, what's your fat ass doing here?
He also threatens to kill Peter. Yes, a direct verbal threat because his girlfriend flirted with him. It's not Peter's fault she asked him to put a bird in her panties. Like, what the hell? Shout out to Mort, though, for towing his car away. One of the few things worse than attempted murder is actual murder. Enter Patrick Pewter Schmidt, aka the Fat Guy Strangler, a serial killer with almost certainly the highest kill count of anyone on Peter's list of enemies. Patrick is the brother of Lois, whom the latter didn't even know existed for many, many years. This was due to Carter placing him in a mental hospital after he had a nervous breakdown upon walking in on his mother performing oral sex on Jackie Gleason. This left him deeply disturbed, and when Lois releases him from the institution, he goes on a killing spree, specifically targeting fat people. He nearly kills Peter too, and after his return in season 10, Patrick disappears, and there is an implication that he may be back to his old ways. That being said, he does show some remorse for his crimes, and even helps Peter and Joe track down the real murderer of Chris's fat camp bunkmates. Even though Stewie was ultimately the one to save Chris with the help of a certain giant robot from a Queen album cover, it's still a good gesture on Patrick's part, and there's not much in that regard for our bottom three. Not trying to get too political here, but our bronze medal of evil goes to former President Donald J. Trump. In the episode Trump Guy, the core conflict stems from Donald Trump sexually harassing Meg. He's also yet another of the giant chicken property damage club due to his massive fight with Peter. When you make Peter Griffin, season 17 Peter, mind you, look like the good guy, you've really screwed up royally.
You can't walk out on me.
Or in this case, screwed up democratically? Whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, it's hard to deny that this portrayal of Trump may just be Family Guy's most utterly vile celebrity portrayal in the entire series, being compared to the absolute worst of Peter himself in terms of morality. Yet, somehow, he still doesn't even come close to being as despicable as our top two. Like the silver medalist of evil, Jeff Fekalman. What a fitting name, because this dude is an absolute vile piece of crap. It's rare to sympathize with someone planning an actual murder, but holy freaking crap, was Glenn doing the world a favor here. Jeff is the former fiance of Quagmire's sister Brenda, who is extremely abusive towards her. Even just changing the channel on her TV is enough to make him go absolutely ballistic. And on top of this, he shows absolutely no redeeming qualities whatsoever. He's totally cool with the idea of murdering Glenn, and even mocks the notion of his and Brenda's child growing up without an uncle. Quagmire may be a pretty scummy guy himself, but next to Jeff, even he looks like an absolute saint in comparison. But there's one adversary on Peter's list who's on a whole nother level compared to these guys, and probably any villain in the series. The gold medal of evil has to go to Carter Pewter Schmidt. One of the many greedy businessmen archetypes in the world of cartoons, Carter is a man who makes Mr. Krabs look like a benevolent being to be revered. Rarely does this hilarious sadistic man have any moment of redemption. While he's financially supportive of his daughter, if nothing else, he's still an overall scumbag with no remorse for any of his crimes. Meeting his wife Barb by hitting her, cheating on Barb, mistreating immigrant workers at his mansion, hiding the cure to cancer so that he could make more money by curing it with expensive treatments, trying to lure Chris into his secret society led by Herbert, mind you, dumping Peter into the ocean so that he won't marry Lois, and generally just being a sadistic man overall. Peter Griffin is not a moral man. I think we've all accepted that by this point. But whenever Carter comes around, it's all of a sudden much easier to sympathize with the fat man. He's not just the most evil of Peter's enemies, but arguably the most evil character in the entire show, which, let me emphasize, is saying a lot.